Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome all to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. We are joined, as always, with a special guest. I have a longtime collaboration partner, Chris Jones, is with us, and she's the CEO and co-founder of Spectra Diversity. And Spectra is the creator of the only DEI assessment, which measures the organization and the individual perceptions of DEI in one single survey. So thankful to have you, Chris. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Julie. It's nice to be with you today.
Well, so Chris is a wealth of information and has lots of data to share with us. So if you are interested in measurement and data and how to tell a good story around real information, Chris is your person. So we'll dig into that in a moment. But Chris, first, tell us your story. How did you get into this DEI space?
There's two tracks that sort of collided in 2016. One of them is I've always been a follower, a person that was interested in social justice, which started out, I protested against the Vietnam War because, yes, I'm that old. I lost a couple of dear friends to AIDS. And if you'll remember in the beginning, we did not know where AIDS came from. I didn't know if I could share, here, taste this, bit of my dinner off my fork that I just ate with. We didn't know if we could do that. And it was the same with COVID. In the beginning, we were washing our groceries and leaving them in the garage to air out for a day before we brought them in the house. And it was the same with AIDS. So I lost friends to AIDS, and then just over time, mostly war protesting, but also the separation of children at the border. I've been out there with my sign so many times. I met my senator, Amy Klobuchar, at the Women's March after the former president was elected, the former, no longer current president was elected. And so anyway, so that was one path. And then the other path was I had my first corporate job was for Honeywell. And I was a producer director. And my boss said, well, you need to write some scripts. And I said, I didn't write scripts, I'm not a writer. And he said, well, you are now. And so I started writing, and over time, it came naturally. It was work, but I discovered that I was better at it than other people. And I got so much work out of it that I was a writer, and I wrote blogs, I wrote websites, I wrote documentaries, I wrote corporate things, corporate trainings. And one of my corporate trainer people that I was working with, we did a lot of work on diversity and inclusion for big companies, Coca-Cola and Verizon and blah, blah, blah. So I was working for her, and she said, well, Chris, I want to, create an assessment that measures both the individual and the organization in a single assessment, because there isn't one. And will you write it for me? And I said, well, how about if I'm a partner instead? And so that's how I became one of the co-founders of Spectra Diversity. We built it in 2016, launched it in 2017. So since that time, I have continued my DEI work, and that I was already doing as a writer, but I learned to love the numbers and to love the stories that the numbers tell. And that's what I hope to talk about today, is the stories that numbers tell.
That's a beautiful segue and title to this podcast. Oh, Chris, what a lovely story. I think from your story, there's always a thread there. I think that if you pay attention to your energy and where you choose to spend time, whether it's protesting, activism, social issues, I often find that's a segue that brings people into the DEI space. So love to see those threads in your story. And, The importance of speaking up and asking for it. What if you hadn't said, "Hey, I want to be a partner"? I mean, what's the worst that could happen? And look at what you
Yeah.
know. And who
Oh,
would
I'm
have
so
known all the explosion of DEI work over the last few years in particular? Y'all were very well positioned to really add value to the marketplace.
And we saw that, after, well, I'm in the Minneapolis area, in a suburb, and after George Floyd was murdered, we were so busy, but a lot of it ended up being, well, we were busy with our assessments, but a lot of companies just did the performative part. They put messages on their websites and said, yeah, we're committed, Black Lives Matter and whatnot. And then COVID came, and it just was kind of a confusing time for everyone. But one of the things that I noticed in the data, and this has to do with COVID, not Black Lives Matter, is that one assessment that they're going to be on their fourth year. They measure every year to see where their progress is. And in their assessment that came right after COVID, their most happy group, I call them happy, but they're the most positive in terms of their perceptions related to DEI. One of the happiest group was the Asian Americans. And after COVID, the Asian American score went from 4.1 on a 1 to 5 score. So that's pretty high. They went to 2.9. And the data always tells you the what. You have to dig a little bit for the why. But my theory is, and this was a management question, is management basically, walking the talk? And the Asian American employees in that company said very clearly, no, they're not. And I think it was the management's lack of response to their, to the Asian hate crimes and to Kung Flu and to all of that their company did not step up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And without
So,
asking those questions, you wouldn't know. What I love about the tool that you have is you can see the organizational piece, but you can see it at the individual level and you can break it down by demographics, by department. It's really telling. It's hard to look at those numbers and not see that bigger story like you did with the AAPI community.
well, and once you get used to looking at the numbers, it's as plain as the nose on your face.
Mm-hmm. Can't
It's
deny it.
so, no,
You can't
no.
say that
And,
that donation, that PR statement, that was enough. Our people are happy. We're moving on. And I think a lot of well-intentioned, but very maybe deniers of, the real longevity of DEI work is they just want to brush it under the rug and move on to the next thing. And that's just not how this works.
it's not. And it's hard for businesses that want to make their business decisions that are evidence-based. I'm thinking particularly medicine. They want to make evidence-based, diagnosis and decisions and treatment plans and all that sort of thing. Well, this is evidence-based DEI. If you're not measuring, you could be tackling something that doesn't need to be tackled. One example of that is one of my colleagues. She was called in to do race training for an organization. And she
Mm-hmm.
said, okay, yeah, I can do that, but let's measure first. And she measured their organization, and the problem that they had was generational. And so if you go in with your standard, here's my training package, here's my unconscious bias package, and you do that, but you don't know that they have generational issues, and you only know what the company told you is that you have race issues, which they actually did not.
Wow.
You'd go in focusing on, you'd have your regular package focus on race, and you'd miss the whole point. You would miss the opportunity that knowing about that generational gap provides to you. So it's
Yep.
basically
Solving
intervention without strategy.
solving the wrong problem. And if you use
Mhm.
medicine like you did as an analogy, it'd be like going in saying my knee hurts. One, giving you surgery, medicine for another part of your body. Like that's a lot of times the DEI practitioners get tasked to do, myself included, is just these whims, these guesses, or hey, we just need to be doing DEI. So like just tell us the things to do. And then it becomes like the shiny object thing. Like, let's talk about disability this month. Let's Black History Month. Let's talk about race this
Squirrel,
month. Yeah.
squirrel.
And you're like, no other thing in business we would do this haphazard. So I really love that your data, and we partner with Chris's organization, by the way. So measuring, getting a snapshot of your organization, and then having that conversation about so what, what the data is the what, but like, so what with the data. So tell us, Chris, like maybe first, let's break it into two steps. Like, what do companies need to be measuring? If you want to measure DEI or get some data on it, what should they be measuring? And then once you get the data, how do you figure out what this means?
Yeah. Oh, well, and that's part of the challenge. Well, and there's a lot of good cultural assessments that are out there, and there's a lot of good individual assessments that are out there. But if you want to, for organizations that are just starting out, it's just good to get a baseline. That's one mistake that some companies say, that, well, we have to get farther in our DEI journey before we measure. It's like, no, 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 you measure at the beginning, because otherwise, you're traveling on your journey, but maybe you've got the wrong roadmap. Maybe you're traveling down, instead of freeways that could take you to where you need to go right away, you're traveling down, the scenic Route 66, when you could get there faster if you just, had the right map. So we provide them with a map. So, and I don't want to, make this a sales pitch, but what we measure is we measure management and culture and the policies, practices, and procedures. That's the organizational bit. And from that, and then also demographics. So you can break those down like we did with the Asian American population and others. And then the individual gets their report, because they don't know where they are. They don't know if they're in, if they're average. Am I above average? Am I below average? They have no clue. And so those can be used for personal benefit, but also, if the person or the company decides that it's okay, and they have to get a release as one of the questions, that personal information can be given to a coach. And so a DEI coach can go through with the individual results and point out where there's opportunities, point out where there's some things where they need some training, where they do need to learn how to have a difficult conversation. They do need to not use the bad words, which I'm still learning about bad words. I just found one the other day, and I've been doing this for quite a while. Low-hanging fruit. Low-hanging fruit. Yeah, I thought low-hanging fruit are the easy wins, well, low-hanging fruit comes from a poem that was made famous in a song about the low-hanging fruit. And I should have pulled up the lyrics beforehand, but basically it's something like blood on the branches, blood on the leaves, blood on the ground, low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging, it refers to lynching.
Wow.
I know.
So deep
I
in
know.
our culture. All these things are so embedded, and
I know. And
we
I
don't think to
can't,
question them.
no, I can't use that phrase anymore. It's like master bedroom and
Yep.
grandfathered in. And there's just so many that are part of, part of our systemic racism that we have in our culture, but also in some organizations.
Oh, yeah. And then people well-intentioned use these phrases haphazardly and don't realize the impact that they're creating and how it lowers the perception of inclusion. One pushback I get, because we have a practice inclusive language workshop, because it is a practice, like you and I just learned something new, right?
Yep.
We're learning, unlearning. Is I get this pushback of actually, I always tell people, like, don't use idioms, don't use like sports analogies and war metaphors. Like, just please get that out, kick that out of the workplace. It never belonged there, but it crept in and it's weird. It's not clear communication. Like you risk people not knowing what you mean. Anyway, so I literally got this pushback from a very kind leader that said, aren't we just, oh gosh, he used an idiom when he explained it. Like, aren't we just, It basically he was saying this, we're making problems where they aren't. Are we just creating these problems by talking about inclusive language? And my point back to him was, if we're not proactive about managing our language and being really intentional with what we're saying, then we risk putting ourselves in a position where microaggressions and non-inclusive and exclusionary and discrimination stereotype behavior happens more often. So do you want to play offense or do you want to play defense, right? Do you want to be proactive or do you want to be reactive? Because I promise you, when you are more inclusive with your language, you will have less cleanups to do with non-inclusive language. And I think for him, that was like, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about it that way. But it does feel like we're asking everybody like revisit their whole vocabulary. That's not
Well,
what we're
and
saying here.
that's part of what's ingrained. Like if you take the IAT, if you take some of those bias tests, implicit association tests from
Yeah, we've
Harvard
talked about that
University.
before. Yeah.
Yeah, and in my logical brain, I know that women can be scientists and men can be, artists or home makers,
Caretakers. Yeah.
caretakers, thank you. And but my logical brain and my programmed brain didn't see that. I still think that men, can do certain jobs better than women and women vice versa. And I know that's not true, but
Right. Our brain.
those biases are hard to, but once you identify them, and then you can see them when they, raise their ugly little heads.
I agree, Chris. So tell us, once you get the data, how do you figure out the story?
Well, like I said, it's as plain as the nose on your face. One of the things that I always recommend, and this is contrary to what some of our clients ask, is they say, well, we know that, management needs the training, so let's just measure management. And that would be, I'll call that a horizontal slice of data. But if you measure vertically, and one of the entire categories is how management is doing, management always shows up. They think they're doing really well. And then when you do that vertical slice and you get everybody that's below the managers responding to the same questions, you see that other employees don't feel the same way, particularly when you look at the demographics, because white straight men will similarly think the way that management does. But when you look at the demographics and you see women always show up as less positive than the men, and especially management men. So, it's just, and that would be the goal. That would be the goal to change. Why are women in our organization feeling less included?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they? Why do they feel positive about the culture but negative about, or less positive about management or the policies, practices, and procedures, which gets into, who gets the cushy project, the high visibility project, how are raises distributed?
Yeah.
How are
Pay
people
equity.
even hired? Are they hired, and there's a 10% wage gap, even when they're hired? Well, then the wage gap, even if they're all getting 3%, increases, the wage gap just grows, so
Well, I think
measure.
yes. And one of the stats that I know when it's been measured over time is the perception of fairness in the workplace is very different from the majority group, or, white male, cisgender, able-bodied, all the things, versus women and people of color. If you just isolate those variables, I know there's been some research out there, like a 20-point difference in perception of fairness. And for women, there's some research coming out. I think McKinsey just published something recently that was like, the further I go, the more I hurt as a woman. So especially as I go up in an organization, when I enter that hierarchy and there's less of people like me, it feels even harder.
Yeah.
And that's the story. If you get that in your data, that's going to be really obvious to see in a report like yours, to pluck out, like, why is that? Like, what experience are we having? And then you can really laser in on specific challenges that employees are facing that you can remedy. It may not always be training. We love to throw training at stuff. I love to do training, but it's not always the solution, right, Chris? There's other things you could
No,
do.
no. Well, and there's the quick wins that you could do. Like we had one, we also have open-ended questions in our survey. And there was one where everybody, they said, what could we do? What the question that the client wanted to ask was, what can we do to make this a more inclusive work environment? And so many people, and I'm assuming they're women because of the statements, they talked about the dress code. And they're all talking about the dress code. It's like, why do we have this? This isn't necessary, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that is a policy, practice, is a procedure. And that is something with the stroke of a pen, somebody at the top can say, okay, this dress code is no longer that, now it's this, and it's the same for men and women, so yeah, it was
I'm not
it's
surprised. And
yeah,
that's
well,
may seem like insignificant, but what an opportunity to revisit the dress code and just clarify expectations for folks. Because I remember that, like the suity environments where you had to wear a suit to work, or I was told or coached on like things to wear and not wear when I prefer to dress more casually. And so much of that has changed through COVID. Now, not in the workplace anymore, thankfully. But people being able to be their authentic self, so much of our covering and filtering and code switching happens by way of our appearance, especially for marginalized groups. So I love that
oh
example,
yeah.
Chris. And you don't know unless you ask. And I love that open-end question. Like one thing we could do to be more inclusive, you can code those responses and bubble up some themes. And wow, then you tell your employees, like we asked, we listened, and we're doing something about it.
And one of the things that research tells us is that the simple fact that you are doing an assessment, doing a survey about the topic, improves the perception of the organization's commitment to DEI.
Mm-hmm.
Just the fact that you're doing it,
Yeah, it's
that you're
accountability.
showing up, you're
Yes.
doing one thing.
Well, and two, not that this should be a motivator, but if you haven't measured it, if you're listening, you're like, my organization hasn't measured it at, I'm hearing a lot from corporate boards are saying, hey, what are you doing to measure DEI? We're seeing things from like NASDAQ and other organizations. If become, industry leader or as you grow and new employees, Gen Z is asking about this too. So you're going to get this pressure. If you haven't done it yet, you might be afraid of what you might find. But like you said, the perception is going to likely increase just by way of doing the activity. You shouldn't be afraid to do this because people are going to be asking and they will be asking much more in the future. Chris, I know you love to look at the future and the predictions. Tell us, what are some key things? We're kind of 2023 slowly kicking into gear. I think the word of the year so far has been uncertainty, certainty about uncertainty. But what do you
Yeah,
see
yeah.
specifically in the DEI space? Where does your magic ball point us?
Well, this is I have no ball, but Josh Burson does have a magic ball. He's been making predictions, doing measurements since 2001, I think, and his company was bought out by Deloitte. So this is pretty darn good data. And a couple of the things that stood out to me is the prevalence of gig workers. A lot of gig workers they already have a full-time job. Their gig job, whether it's DoorDash or whatever, is on top of their full-time jobs. So 67% of gig workers are Hispanic, Black, or Asian. 13% are white. I love this one. 230% diverse companies generate 230% higher cash flow than non-diverse organizations. And of companies with gender and generational diversity on their boards, they outperform their industry peers by 89%. And even in the face of all this, only 1 in 4 companies work to actively mitigate bias in their rewards programs, their performance and talent processes. Only 1 in 10 monitor AI technology for embedded or algorithmic bias, and that would be in job applications and things like that. And only 1 in 5 have considered embarking on a pay equity program.
Oh,
And
that
those are
pains
all,
me. Yeah.
I know. And those are all, 7, and here's one. Simulate diverse, only 7 in 100 simulate diverse or microaggressions in their DEI training. And I know that's a topic near
Oh,
and dear to
so
your heart, is
common.
working on microaggressions.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've specifically delivered content just on microaggressions because unconscious bias training, especially the mandatory check the box kind, just doesn't do that topic justice.
Right. When you look at figures like this, it's like, why, when you're in a recession or approaching a recession, as we're said to be doing, why would you cut HR budgets or DEI budgets, if you even have one, when your people are your greatest strength and your greatest portion of your probably of your payroll is a
Yeah.
huge part of companies' businesses,
Yeah.
and competing for those employees when unemployment is so low. You better be walking the talk.
Yeah. Yeah,
um
even with the economy slowing, I mean, I think the R word's been thrown around for a long time, and we're still
right.
uncertain if that's really going to happen, but we're still going to have a labor shortage. These baby boomers are retiring finally. And what I'm finding is, Gen Z is massively diverse. Their expectation of an inclusion is much higher than past generations. So
Yeah.
to your point, if you want to be competitively differentiated, it's probably through your people because products and services are mimicked so quickly.
Yep.
People is really the only lasting sustainable competitive differentiation. And wow, I mean, back to your gig worker stat, that tells me that folks with diverse backgrounds are like, peace out, corporate America. Like, this isn't for me. I can go do this on my own. I know that happened to me 8 years ago, and I'm so thankful. But we know that people can do that now. Like the gig economy and being able to find folks on Fiverr and Upwork and,
Yep.
go work at contracting for other big companies. Yeah, then I can choose how
Well,
because
and
of the
millennials are only staying with their jobs for 2.5 years,
yeah,
and 60% of them would bail.
yeah,
That's, think of that in terms of how many people you have in your organization where their age lies. And then, with baby boomers such as myself, becoming part of the past.
yeah,
Yeah, it's
yeah. That loyalty and we don't stay places we don't feel like we belong. We don't stay places that aren't fair.
no.
And so the millennial stat is really interesting because that's 75% of our workforce here in the next couple years. That's
Yep.
the lion's
It's
share of our workforce. So I think for corporate folks, and we have very passionate people about DEI that listen to our podcast, this might be things you already know, but I think take these nuggets and elevate it to the people that don't get it. Like we need business leaders, decision makers to understand the importance of DEI long term. Like this is not a 2020 thing. This is a forever
well,
thing.
and 1.5 hours of an unconscious bias seminar is not going to change your culture. You need to take a more holistic look at it. You need to look at your demographics. And then you need to track it. And, for business owners or even HR people, chief CHRO, chief human resource officer. Yep, that's the right letters. Might be afraid, am I going to see bad news? And the reality is this essentially looks like a bell curve.
Mm-hmm.
So even if you think you're bad, you're probably in the middle of the pack, because that's where most companies are. They're in
Mm-hmm.
the middle of the pack. There are very few who are truly, truly awful. And there are very few that are truly, the role models for the rest of the organizations that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very slim trail on either end of the
Mm-hmm.
bell curve. And most people are kind of in the middle. So,
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Don't be afraid. And like you said, you measure it and perceptions are likely going to increase. So you get a win just from measuring it. And of
mhm.
course, you want to do something with what you measure, but even if you don't, you're creating more positive momentum. but definitely take action, have.
Well, and that's where a DEI consultant, such as yourself, or sometimes they're internal, but we'll be able to take that data, and we do help. We do a debrief. So we say, here's what we see in the data, and it's all color coded, so it's easy to look at. But, here's some things that you could do. And then your culture, your organization, which are the things, where are your quick wins? And then where are the things that are really going to take a couple of years to implement, and do both of those at the same time. You don't have to start out with the big, long, huge thing. You can do some little things, like change your dress code or change comp time. You can make little changes as well.
Bite size it. I think there's some tangible things that you can do, but you need to know what problem you're trying to solve before you just solve a blanket problem. There's not one solution to this. And your example about unconscious bias treating, that was the Band-Aid that got thrown on the DEI wound for the last decade or so. And we actually see, if you just do that mandatory once a year or whatever, which is so common, it's so common that's the only thing organizations do, can actually cause a backlash effect. And we're seeing some of that right now, where white men feel fearful about the conversation, or people feel like it's too much too quick. You get a retaliation factor. And then for folks that are all in, they're like, this is obviously not enough. So having a prescriptive solution meets people where they're at on the journey. And if you bite size it, you're not going to scare people as much. So I love everything you said, Chris. I know we could talk about data for hours, but if you can leave our listeners with one nugget, or, one thing you wish people understood more about DEI, what would it be?
I think the key thing is that you want to measure before making your decisions and setting your strategies, and even before doing coaching. This gets back to that evidence-based decision making. If you know the data, you know where to go. You've got your roadmap, so measure. Don't head off down a path and do stuff and then measure. Measure right away.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be cost prohibitive. It should be something that organizations just do, and they should be proud and publicize their improvements, which some companies do. They say, last year we were here, this year we're in this other spot, we've improved. And wouldn't that be a nice thing to have on your website?
Oh, yeah. And when people ask, you have an answer and you have accountability. And even if it's just improving, right? Even if you're not where you want to be, the fact that you can show progress and improvement is just so reassuring to people that you care.
Yeah. Well, you're closer to a B- than a C+.
Yeah. Yeah. And don't be afraid of the C+. It is what it is. The data is what it is. It's important that it informs. And measure it before you do. Just, again, do it on a whim. And I will share too, we're currently onboarding a lot of our clients with this process, and it's pretty painless. It doesn't take a long time. It's not, I think people see these long employee engagement surveys. This is much more condensed. And
it's 10 minutes.
It doesn't take
10 minutes, 10 minutes.
It's not a huge effort, right? You can pull the data. No. This is why it's great that you have an organization that's done all the algorithms and the statistician, proven these questions, why we ask them and what drives behavior. So it's a pretty painless process. And of course, you want to communicate the importance and why we're doing this up front to your employees before you just ask them. But if you do a good job of explaining the why, get the what, and then ask the so what, it can be a really great experience in a few months' time. So I would just encourage listeners, if you haven't taken a snapshot yet, consider looking at Spectra. Contact us. We do some consulting work. To Chris's point about the do part, the action planning part is what we help with. So thank you,
You're
Chris,
very welcome
today. This has been lovely. Tell our listeners, how can they get in touch and learn more about Spectra?
Well, our website is Spectra Diversity, one word, spectradiversity.com. If you'd like to have a demo, you go to the Contact Us page, and there's a little calendar there, and you just sign up for it. We can also send you things, but, whether you're doing a culture-only assessment or an individual-only assessment or ours, which is both, I just encourage you to do some sort of measurement that is statistically valid.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of tools out there. And we dabbled in one that was not scientifically vetted. And as you know, we don't do that anymore because we know the power of your assessment. And so really practicing due diligence in this work, much like we would in any other aspect of business, I think is really important. So check out the tools Chris has there, and listeners, contact us if you want to learn more. Thanks so much for being on today, Chris. It was lovely.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, consider hiring Julie and the Next Pivot Point team to come speak at your organization's next event. We speak on a range of topics from active allyship to inclusive leadership to how to create a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and feels a sense of belonging. Thank you for being on this journey with us. Go to nextpivotpoint.com to learn more.